Friends, we're going to review the Sicha of volume 18, the Sicha of Chukas number 2, which is in fact a siyum, completion of the tractate of Nida, and is customary when you make a siyum of a tractate, you elaborate on the last section, which the Rabbi does in this instance. The connection to the Torah portion of Chukas, because the beginning of the portion is, this is the Chukah, the statute of the Torah, the law of the red heifer. When someone becomes impure when coming in touch with a dead body, either by touching it or being in the same enclosure, the same room or tent, they need to become purified in a very special fashion. This is considered the highest degree of impurity, and you need to use the ashes of the red heifer mixed with water, sprinkled on the fourth day of the week, and then on the seventh day, and then they become purified. There's all kind of laws that are involved, and the Torah calls it Chukas Torah, the statute of the Torah, meaning it's a super rational law. We don't understand the reason for it. There are many mitzvahs in Torah which we don't have reasons, like milk and meat, and most of them kosher laws, shatnez. However, this is considered the most super rational, to the extent that King Solomon, it is said, knew the reasons for all the others. Whatever the word reason means in this case, King Solomon, the wisest of all men, understood it. However, this one, he said, no, I thought I'm wise, but I see it's distant from me, unquote, that even Solomon did not know the meaning of the red heifer, whereas Moses, it is said that God said, L'cha ani megala tam para, you, I will reveal the reason or the explanation or the meaning of this mitzvah. However, before God revealed it to him, it is said that when Moses was learning this concept that someone becomes impure, to such a degree, how? Because they came in touch with a dead body, it says, Niskarkem upanav, his face like turned colors. Like, how can this person become pure? And God introduced him to the red heifer. So it's the theme of the portion, or the beginning of the portion, this idea of a super rational law of how we become purified when we come in touch with a dead body. I want to say by way of introduction, two things. First of all, I don't touch the whole Sicha. It's a lot. I take out a certain section of it to keep it organized and clear. I might say that in this particular Sicha, I'm covering most of sections 2 through 10, but not before or after that. I also want to point out that this Sicha is very analytical. You might say this is like studying Talmud on a pretty good level. The study of Talmud is analysis of Torah for its own sake. It's not like studying Jewish law where you want to know what to do. It's not even just like studying the Jewish knowledge to gain knowledge. This is an area of Torah study which is analytical in nature, where you argue different sides and different approaches, totally theoretical often. And the purpose of it is exactly that, the mental exercise of Torah. And often a person might say, what's the point? I'm not walking away with a bottom line law necessarily. It might be a law which is not even practically relevant to me or nowadays at all. Secondarily, I'm not even walking away necessarily with new information. I'm just taking the same information and splitting the hair once and twice and 3 times and arguing analysis, really like mental exercise. And what's the point? And the answer is, people spend their free time doing crossword puzzles. What's the point? Mental exercise. Well, Judaism says, don't waste your time on crossword puzzles. Do mental exercise that connects you to God's wisdom. Every mitzvah, the real reason for a mitzvah is to connect to God. The Hebrew word, the Aramaic word mitzvah means tzavta, or the Aramaic translation, if you will, of the word mitzvah is tzavta, connection. By doing a mitzvah commandment, you connect to God. However, the greatest connection is in Torah study, because while you do a physical mitzvah, you connect to God, so to speak, body, or your body connects to God. Whereas when you study Torah, your mind fuses with that of God. But in Torah study itself, it's arguable that the highest level of Torah study, which is why most of the time is spent on this style of Torah study in the yeshiva and in general in life, is a Talmudic analysis. Because even more so than just studying information or laws, here's where your mind is being formed in accordance with God's thinking. And Judaism sees every valid Torah approach or Torah question and answer, and even thought process, to be literally that of God's thought process, Torah thought process, and thereby your mind is binding with that of God. So this Sicha does that in a great way. This is a mental exercise of a unification with Hashem in the mitzvah of the study of Talmud, of analytical study. I'm going to open up a spreadsheet which will help us get through this in the clearest fashion. So at the end of the tractate Nida, there's a conversation. The people of Alexandria, the Jews of Alexandria, asked Rabbi Yeshua 3 foolish questions. Number 1, does Lot's wife transmit impurity? We know that a dead body transmits impurity by, as we said before, touching it or being in the same enclosure. Lot's wife was a dead body. She was punished. She turned into a pillar of salt. She was dead. But there's no body. It's just a pillar of salt. Would that theoretically transmit impurity? Question 2. Does the Shunammite's son transmit impurity? The story in the book of Samuel where he revived this woman's baby. It's a whole story where he blessed her with a baby. She didn't think she could have one. And the baby was born and then died at a very, very young age. And she fetched him and he came and closed the door and put his mouth on the baby's mouth and then walked around the room 7 times and kept repeating this. And this was clearly not mouth-to-mouth resuscitation, by the way, because a long time had lapsed since the baby died. She had to send messengers for him. Clearly, he was doing something on a whole different level and literally revived the baby, brought him back to life. And this is the second question. Is that baby considered alive or dead? Because, it's alive, but it really died. So does it give impurity? The third question is similar. Will a resurrected require sprinkling? Can they carry impurity? When Mashiach comes and everyone is resurrected, every Yid is resurrected, perhaps even some of the righteous Gentiles are resurrected. Are they considered like dead people walking around that now we have to worry about impurity? So these are the 3 questions. The Talmud calls them foolish questions. On the surface, it looks like they're just like, playing around and teasing him and saying, hey, a corpse, a dead body creates impurity. Well, what about Lot's wife? And what about Shunamit's kid? He's dead, but now he's alive. What about all of us in the future? So it seems like a foolish conversation. But the Rebbe says that even though the Talmud refers to it as foolish, it clearly cannot be foolish. It would not be included in the Talmud. Every word of the Talmud is Torah study on a Talmud level. So what could really be the significance of these questions? And yet the Talmud does still refer to them as foolish, as the Rebbe is going to say. They're not foolish, they're brilliantly foolish. They're brilliant questions, brilliant analysis. However, they're still foolish because in the end, the analysis is besides the point, as we'll see. So the Rebbe asks a couple of questions on this. A, what's the depth in this conversation and yet still called foolish? B, why are they asking 3 questions? If we're assuming this is not foolish, but it's with content, it's really one question. So why do they keep asking it in different ways? The third question that I'm focusing on the Rebbe is, why the change of language in the third question? The first 2 are straightforward. Does this give impurity? Does this give impurity? The third question should have been the same. Do the resurrected give impurity? Why the change of the language? And finally, in question 1 and 2, Rabbi Yeshua answered no, and no again. Whereas in question 3, he said, well, we'll see what happens then. He gives also a second answer, but I'm not including it in my presentation. So the Rebbe says, we know it's a great virtue in Torah study that if you don't know the answer, you should simply say, I don't know. It's in Pirkei Avos, Ethics of Our Fathers. One of the signs of a chacham, a smart person, is that which they don't know, they simply say, I don't know. He didn't know. He should have said, I don't know. Why does he have to say, well, we'll wait and see? Why is he being so fancy? So these are the questions that we are posing from the Sicha. Again, there are some more nuanced questions, but I'm focusing, suffice it, with this. So the presentation of it begins as follows. Transmittal of impurity has 2 requirements. I'm down on the screen. A body, and B, from which a soul has departed. That's nominally how we create the impurity of tumas mesa, of impurity of a corpse. You need a body from which a soul has departed. That's what we're calling it A and B. And the way the Rebbe is going to present it is like this. The 3 questions on your screen. Question 1 is essentially, is requirement A satisfied? Do we sufficiently have a body here? Question 2, is requirement B satisfied? Do we sufficiently have a departure of soul here? And question 3, as we'll see clearly, both A and B, body and soul departure, have been satisfied. What we're asking a totally different question. So there you have the whole Sicha in a nutshell. We're going to go into it. But the organization of it says the Rebbe is brilliant. They're not asking the same question at all. They're asking three different questions and building one upon the other. First is A satisfied, then is B satisfied, and then once you satisfied both, there's a third separate question entirely. So let's get into it. So question one is, does Lot's wife transmit impurity? And as we explained, what's the question? And question one is requirement A satisfied. What's requirement A for impurity to be transmitted by dead body? That you have to have that actual body. And the question is Lot's wife considered a body? So we have two analyses that the Rabbi presents. Analysis one, she turned into a pillar of salt. Is a pillar of salt still a body, or is it just a pillar of salt? Now, how do we mean that? So the Rebbe introduces a fascinating conversation. We know in Torah there are two types of miracles. There are miracles which come along and they transform the reality from what it was before to a new reality. It's a miracle. But now, once that transformation has taken place, it sticks. It's now the new natural order. What's an example for that? In the plague of frogs. Moses promises frogs. There are no frogs around. It's a miracle. Suddenly, millions of frogs show up. Miraculous, no question about it. However, after they showed up on the scene, now they're a natural phenomenon. Frogs, once they exist, are not a miracle. The miracle was only the first moment when he said, let there be frogs. But once they came, they're here. They're part of nature. In fact, they required another miracle to get rid of them after the week of the plague. However, there's another type of miracle. And that would be that when God makes the miracle, when he takes the nature and transforms it to miracle, he doesn't totally transform it to miracle. It remains natural, but he imposes the miracle upon it. But really, underneath that miracle, it's still natural. The example I'm going to use, one of the examples the Rebbe gives, the plague of blood. God said to Moses, turn the Nile to blood. But the Nile water did not really turn to blood. Proof is when the Jews drank it, it tasted like water. Even when the Egyptians drank it and they bought it from the Jew, it tasted like water. So what was it? Was it still water, or did it miraculously turn to blood? And the answer is, it was water, which miraculously every moment, the miracle of blood has been imposed on it. But underneath it was still water. Hence, at the end of the week, we don't find that Moses had to do another act to undo it, and he didn't have to drain the Nile and wash out that blood so the water can come back in. He just stopped making the miracle, and that superimposed miraculous form of blood went away, and it reverted back to what it really was, water. What, in fact, it was really all along, the eye of the Jew. So these are two types of miracles. I'm calling them transformative, where the original state disappears and a new nature takes its place, that of the miracle, or no, the original nature remains and the miracle superimposes itself. Says the Rebbe, that is the first conversation that the people of Alexandria were asking Rabbi Yehoshua. When Lot's wife, miraculously, because of a punishment that she deserved, turned from a corpse or from a person to a pillar of salt. Is it that she's no longer a body, but she became a pillar of salt? In which case, she clearly doesn't have requirement A. She's not a body, and they will not be able to transmit impurity. Or no, was it a constant miracle, meaning that she remained a body, but God imposed the miracle that that body looks like a pillar of salt, but it's really underneath still a body that every moment is becoming a pillar of salt, and therefore in that case it's still a body, and it can give off impurity. So already we see the people of Alexandria, these nudniks were really brilliant, and they asked a brilliant analytical question. And then the Rabbi says is another analysis that perhaps they were alluding to as well. We're trying to decide if this pillar of salt fulfills requirement A, namely, you need a body. Well, let's see. Do we really need a body? Do we even need that requirement? The analysis here is fantastic. When a person dies, and now we say there's impurity on that corpse, is it the actual movement of the soul leaving the body that creates the impurity because of the vacuum, I guess, or the soul leaving. So now you're left with impurity. Or no, once the soul leaves, the result of dead body, that's impurity. So it is the actual movement, the activity, the happening of the soul leaving that creates impurity in its wake? Or is it the result of that now there's a body that's dead and lifeless, and therefore that is impure? And the Rabbi points out that we find this analysis in many mitzvahs, and one of the examples is a bris. It's a mitzvah to enter into the covenant with God with a bris, but the question is, how do you enter that covenant? Is it the act of the bris, or is it the result that once you did the bris, the person doesn't have the arl of the foreskin? And the difference would be perhaps huge. If the arl of the foreskin grew back, or God forbid he put it back, did he now lose the covenant with God or not? Depends. If the covenant is created by the act of the bris, he still has it. If the covenant is created by the result of the act of the bris, namely that we remove the arl of the foreskin, he doesn't have it. And the Rabbi gives another example of a mitzvah like that. Apparently, there are numerous examples in Torah where we analyze, is the mitzvah the act or the result of the act? You're supposed to put on the tefillin, or you're supposed to have been wearing them. In fact, in that case, the Rebbe analyzes that depends between the arm tefillin and the head tefillin. So that's an interesting analysis in many areas of Torah. So the Rebbe says if it's true in mitzvahs, it's also true, I guess, in the negative side with impurity. We can analyze. Torah says a person dies, the soul departs, the body is impure. But is the departure of the soul creates impurity, the vacuum, or is it no? Now that the soul left, the body became impure as a result. And this becomes the analysis. Does Lot's wife, a pillar of salt, create impurity? If it's about the departure of the soul clearly departed. So she's impure. Who cares if she's flesh or if she's salt? The soul left and it leaves impurity in its wake. Conversely, if no, we say the soul leaves and therefore the body now, the result, the dead body becomes impure. There's no dead body to speak of. So right away we see the brilliance of these people of Alexandria, which is why it's in the Torah, in the Talmud. However, why is it called foolish? Because the sage Rabbi Yeshua answered them, and he said, no, Lot's wife does not transmit impurity. But he said the reason is because the Torah says only a corpse transmits impurity and not a pillar of salt. What he was saying really is that it doesn't matter analysis 1, analysis 2. It doesn't matter. It's just because there's no body, therefore there's no impurity. You don't need to analyze. Your analysis is foolish in the end. It's not foolish, it's brilliant. That's why it didn't become omitted from the Talmud. But it's not the conclusion. And it's beside the point. That's how the Rebbe translates it. It's a brilliant foolishness. It's beside the point. It's not how we judge this case. However, it's in the Talmud because it does provide an opportunity for fantastic analysis as per the above. So that's question 1. Lot's wife transmit impurity? The answer is no, but that's not a foolish question at all. You can analyze it in both ways, and it's fantastic. Question 2. Does a Shunammite's son transmit impurity? Here we're going to say that we're checking in if requirement B is in place. Namely, to have impurity, a soul has to have departed. Let's think about this. The kid died, a soul departed. But then a soul came back. Another soul came back and revived him. So do we say, wait a minute, the soul departed, that's it, you have impurity. What happened subsequently doesn't really matter. Or do we say, no. It's true a soul departed, but now there's a soul once again, and therefore it undoes that status, and there's no impurity, and it can't transmit impurity. And the Rebbe further analyzes it. So this is it. Question 2 is B, the departed soul issue satisfied. The analysis, a soul left, but another soul replaced it. And the Rebbe specifically says that it's another soul. It's not just a soul left and the same soul came back. In that case, there wouldn't even be a question. If the same soul came back, so There's a departed soul, but now it's undeparted. So clearly it can't continue to transmit impurity. However, in the case of Elisha, the way the story is told, he put his mouth onto the baby and he blew into the baby his own life force. In a sense, I guess that child now has an extension of Elisha's soul, not his own. His soul passed. And that's why it's an interesting analysis. His soul departed. And if a departed soul creates impurity, it should be impurity perhaps. The fact that now there's a soul, but it's not his soul, does that undo it? And based on this, Rabbi explains why the example that they chose is Elisha, and not another story in the Tanakh, in the Bible, which is earlier than Elisha, story of Elijah who brought back a child from dead to life. He should have chosen the people of Alexandria should have chosen that case. It's earlier in the Bible, in Tanakh. The Rebbe says that by Elijah, it clearly says that he took that child and brought him back to life. He took his soul and put it back into him. And then they wouldn't have asked the question. If you take the soul departs and the same soul comes back, of course, it's now undeparted. However, if the soul departs and another soul takes its place, now you have an interesting question, perhaps. However, Rabbi Yeshua answers no. Conclusion, it doesn't matter because both body and soul are present. Or in the language of Rabbi Yeshua, corpse gives impurity, not a living person. And therefore, this is why, in the end, this brilliant argument is still foolish, because it's beside the point. We don't need to analyze that. The bottom line is, Torah says that a corpse, and here we don't have a corpse. So now we've satisfied question 1 and 2. What about question 3? So the Rebbe, again, in my view, is presenting a very organized thing. So in question 1, we addressed requirement A. Is there not a body, or do we not need a body for impurity? Question 2, is there not a departed soul? In the case of that boy who was brought back to life. Question 3, when you talk about the people who will be resurrected when Mashiach comes, may it be speedily in our time. Here, we clearly have both requirements. We have a body, and it's alive. The souls came back, and not someone else's soul, but their own soul. So clearly, question 3 cannot be, will the resurrected transmit impurity? We already know the answer for question 1 and 2. Clearly, the resurrected will not transmit impurity. We know from 1 and 2 already, you need a body and you need a soul to be departed. In the case of the resurrected, the body will be there. It won't be a corpse. It'll be a living body, and it will be resurrected by its own soul, no less. So if in question 2 we said no, question 3 certainly not. It's not even a question. And therefore they don't ask it in the same language. They're asking a different question completely. Not will the resurrected be able to transmit impurity, but rather will the resurrected Jews themselves be impure? And therefore will they require sprinkling of the red heifer? Why should they become impure? So this is a whole different analysis. Because when a person dies, there's still a loose bone, a little tiny part of the body, even after the body disintegrates. There's still something left. And when the resurrection comes, the rest of the body will be recreated. So here's the analysis. If the resurrection may be inspired by that remaining loose bone, however, it's a totally new body, so why should it be impure? There's no impurity. A baby's born, he's not impure. He didn't touch a dead body. He's a new body. However, if we look at it as it's looked at in some Torah sources, that loose bone will remain, and that dead loose bone will now grow out a living extension, the rest of the body. That loose bone is impure, it's been dead. The rest of the body now comes to life, but it touched the loose bone. It literally grew out of the loose bone, if you will. And therefore, this living body is touching a dead organ, and perhaps they should require sprinkling. This is a whole separate analysis, sort of unrelated in the sense of how is resurrection going to take place? As a totally new thing or an extension of the old? And to this, Rabbi Yeshua didn't say, no, it doesn't give impurity. He said we have to wait and see. In fact, that's a pretty good question. We have to wait and see how resurrection will take place, and then we'll know the answer to this question. So that becomes question 3. Both body and soul are both requirements of body and soul are satisfied. The question is not whether they'll transmit impurity. Certainly they won't. Rather, whether they will be impure. And the analysis is the resurrection is a completely new body or a combination of the old and the new, in which case there's an argument to say that they would need to sprinkle the water of the red heifer. And basically this explains, just to take one last look at the 3 questions. This explains how these are foolish but brilliant. They're brilliant because each one is an analysis. And yet they're foolish because, as we said, because the answers that he gave is that it's beside the point. Even though question 3, he didn't sort of dismiss it, but certainly 1 and 2. The other thing is that they're not the same question being repeated in a different way like a nudnik would do. Each one is building on the other. Each one is a different analysis. The Rebbe's brilliant explanation. Also, we understand clearly why question 3 is worded differently. It's not only worded differently, it's a whole different question, because the other 2 questions would not apply to question 3, as we said. And finally, the fact that he answered question 3 and he didn't say, I don't know, because that's not what he was saying. If it's just a nudnik asking and the answer is, I don't know. But if it's someone asking us a question of content, how will resurrection take place based on which we'll know the answer? He says, why don't we wait and see? Quite impressive how the Rebbe takes this argument and adds so much brilliance and so much Torah analysis to what seems to be just a bunch of foolish arguments. I want to just point out that I taught this class in my own Chabad House group. We have a group of Yidden in our local community, many of whom happen to be doctors and surgeons. And they really enjoyed this particular analysis and Sicha. And one of the surgeons asked the following question. He says, what if I'm having a bad day at work? I'm operating on someone and he dies on the operating table and he stops beating. The heart stops to beat. And they do CPR. It takes them whatever time it takes them. Maybe it takes them a half hour, an hour. They bring him back to life. Does that person give over impurity? That was his question after this whole Sicha. So we had a discussion, and I researched it a little bit with Rabbi Levi Gerelik and the doctors themselves. And so I said to them, well, let's take an analysis. You're asking if that person that you just revived, after, let's argue, is dead for an hour, does he give over impurity? So first of all, are you asking, does he give over impurity? Does he transmit impurity after he's been brought back to life? The answer is clearly no. If the Shanamite son, who got back as a different soul, we still say he doesn't transmit impurity after he came back to life. Clearly, this person who CPR brought back his own soul, he's not going to transmit impurity after he's brought back to life. Not an issue. What about during the hour that they were working on him to bring him back to life? So for argument's sake, you say he's dead. During that hour, did he transmit impurity? Do Kohanes have to run out, or did they have to run out? One of my colleagues on a Sicha exchange said, during that hour, doing CPR, we might say he's medically dead. What happens if his wife accepts a marriage proposal at that time, Kiddushin, from someone else? Obviously, the marriage, they weren't so in love. If while the guy goes into cardiac arrest, she goes and gets a ring from someone else and gets married, but as a theoretical. And then he comes back to life an hour later. Is she still married to the second guy? Did she get married while her husband was dead or not? So this is a more interesting question. So the question first is, what about in case number 2 with the Shunammite, with Elisha? What about there? During that hour, did Elisha become impure? Did other people in that room become impure or not? So there the answer is clearly from the sources that yes. The boy really died. Elisha miraculously brought him back to life. It wasn't a medical procedure. And therefore, anyone in that room would have become impure. I even saw in one of the sources that Elisha himself was a Kohen. And there's an argument that he shouldn't have gone in. He's a Kohen. Kohen is not allowed to be in a place of someone dead. Well, you're going to say he's trying to bring him back to life, but he's trying to bring him back by a miracle. You can't rely on miracles. He's a Kohen. How can he go in? And the answer is he knew that his merit will be strong enough to bring him back to life. And therefore, it's no different than a Kohen who's a medic who goes in to save a life. So in the case of Elisha, the Shunammite, during the period of time the boy was dead, he was dead and certainly did transmit impurity. In the case, however, of the operating room, where the CPR is performed and they bring him back to life a half hour, an hour later, it's pointed out that no, it would not transmit impurity. The person is not considered dead. Or in that fantastical case of the wife using the moment to marry someone else, she would not be married to the other person. She's still married to him. And why? Explain to me, Rabbi Chelek, that in fact, when a person has cardiac arrest or whatever, and they're brought back to life, they never really died. There's something still going on. I don't know enough about this, whether it's a brainwaves or whether it's a heartbeat. But if someone is brought back to life at the end of the day, they never really fully died and the soul never left them. And therefore, clearly, there's no tumas meis, no transmittal of impurity. Unlike the case of Elisha with the boy who was actually dead. But in our operating rooms, it would not transmit impurity. And all the surgeons of my group concurred that that's the case, that if someone is brought back to life, they never really died. I want to just conclude with a takeaway. I believe that the Sicha should have a takeaway. There is a takeaway at the end, but it's not in the portion of the Sicha that I covered. So I want to share a lesson from this whole concept of Chukas, of the statutes of the Torah, of the impurity, the red heifer remedies, based on a Sicha elsewhere, the Kutei Sichas, in a few places, and most notably in volume 2, I believe. The Rabbi says there, what is this language? I mentioned it earlier, that Moses was so baffled. His face turned colors when he talked about a person coming in touch with a dead body. With what will he be purified? Moses was shaken up. Like, what's the big deal? God can do anything. I mean, why can't he be purified? And God says, no, he will be purified, and it's a statute, and you will even understand it, that which Solomon himself could not. So it's explained in the Sicha that the question here is not so much about the actual impurity of a dead body, but it's the proverbial concept that it represents, namely sin. A mitzvah means we're connected to Hashem, the source of life. God forbid we sin, we're separated from the source of life. It's a spiritual form of death. So the fact that we touch a dead body or come in contact with it, it creates impurity. It's because death is symbolic or carries the proverbial message of sin. And if one sins, they're not cleaving to God, they're dead. As the verse says in Deuteronomy, you who cleave to God, you live. God is the source of life. Now, there's different levels of impurity. There's impurity not from dead corpses. There's impurity from coming in touch with insects, other forms. However, that would represent a lesser level of sin. This sin or that sin, and you can purify. How do you purify? Namely, teshuvah. However, when Moses came across the idea of impurity, of coming in contact with dead body, which translates in proverbially to mean the person performed sins to the point that he disconnected from Hashem. Maybe he did the worst sins of Chukas, which disconnect you or whatever. He turned his back completely on the relationship. Moses' face turned color. He lost connection. So how can you reconnect it? So long there's still a connection. In the metaphor of Tanya, that the soul is a thick rope tied together with 613 threads, and you, God forbid, cut one thread or another, you put it back together. But if you cut the whole rope, how can you revive it? How can you bring back that soul? Moses turned colors. There's a disconnect. A Jew is lost, so to speak. Says God to Moses, no, this is a statute of the Torah. It's super rational. Because the connection of Jew to God is super rational. It's not like two things that are connected. It's like two things that are really one, super rationally. In fact, the word for chukah, super rational mitzvah, is the same as the word lachkok, to engrave. Because letters that are engraved, it's not like written letters which can be erased and rewritten, but like engraved letters which can never disappear. The letter and the stone are one and the same. Similarly, the mitzvahs of chukim denote the concept that a Jew and God are one. We're not two that are connected. We're one, therefore inseparable forever, no matter what, which is why perhaps God gives us mitzvahs that are super rational and we embrace them because we don't need a reason. If this is what God wants, that's what we want. We're engraved, we're one. And therefore, the absolute primary super-rational mitzvah in Torah is the mitzvah of the impurity of the red heifer, remedies, the impurity of death, namely to allude to this concept that a person who did the cardinal sins, he turned his back. He completely turned his back on everything Jewish. He's never really severed because his connection is engraved with God. Not written, but engraved. And in fact, that connection is something that every Jew gets by virtue of Moses, because each of us has a piece of Moses in us, as brought in Tanya from the Talmud famously. But that's why each of us has a piece, Moshe Shabikirba, and brought in Tanya chapter 42. Each of us has a little Moses in me, as the eighth day likes to say. And the Moses of our Rebbe, of our generation, of each generation. And therefore we each have a piece of Hashem, just like Moses, meaning to say we can never be severed. And therefore Moses, God says to him, I know no one can understand that, even Solomon, but Lachani Megalatam, part of you, for you, this is not a big problem. You're Moses. You know that the connection to God is one and eternal and ingrained and engraved, and know that each Jew has that piece of Moses. And you therefore know the reason or the concept. I want to just conclude with a beautiful Hasidic story. That in the tough shins in the 1940s, the previous Rebbe sent a shliach to go to Chicago. I believe it was Reb Shmuel Levitin, the famous Rav and Mashpia, to go to Chicago for his outreach work, whether it was raising money for the yeshiva, talking in the shuls, inspiring the Yidden and the Hasidim. And one of the instructions the previous Rebbe gave him, in addition to the general mission, was to seek out a Jew named Mr. Listener, philanthropic Jew who wasn't apparently very religious, and to spend time with him and inspire him. So he seeked him out, and they got an appointment for him, and he went to see him. This Mr. Listener, turns out, comes from Hasidim, or from the city of Liozna, way back, from the Alter Rebbe city, and that's perhaps how we got the name Listener, from Liozna. So there was Hasidic yichus, so to speak, Hasidic background, but he himself was not living that life at all. But he welcomed the previous Rebbe Shliach warmly and gave him the time of day, and he spoke about Torah and inspiration and what have you. And then the man finally pulls out his checkbook and he says, so who do I make the check to? And Reb Shmuel Levitin, the messenger, the Shliach, said, no, I didn't come for that. That's not the purpose of this visit. So he said, so why did you come? So he said, let me explain it to you this way. All the Jewish people are like one big Torah scroll, each of us representing a letter. If one letter in a Torah scroll gets scratched or popped off the parchment, the whole Torah scroll is invalidated. And therefore, sometimes a Jew, the letter gets smushed or cracked or falls off, the Jew disconnects from Torah. So the Rabbi sends traveling scribes to re-inspire them and rewrite that letter. And the man accepted the explanation, and that was that. When the Shliach, Reb Shmuel, came back to New York and he was debriefed in the Yechidus of the previous Rabbi, so he told, among other things, this conversation. And what he answered the person of why he came, the analogy of the traveling scribe. And the Rebbe, the previous Rebbe, didn't love the explanation. And he explained why. He said, because a Jew's connection to God is not like a written letter, which can pop off or crack and needs to be rewritten. But rather, it's like an engraved letter in the stone. It can never disappear. It can never disconnect. It is the stone. The worst thing that could happen is that some dust accumulates to the point that you don't see the letter. So you don't need a traveling scribe. You need a traveling duster. That's my own words. You need to dust it off, but don't not that, God forbid, we have to recreate the connection. The connection is not severable, which is in essence the message of, or one of the messages of Parshas Chukas.